Preface. My story. Throughout my life, I've been obsessed with understanding how some people always manage to have lots of money, while many others never seem to have any. When I was about 6 years old, I was hiding in the corner listening and watching my parents as everything for them fell apart. My father's business had collapsed and they were financially destroyed. Our phone had been cut off and the electricity would go in a couple of days. The bank manager had been to my father's parents' house to inform them that if they did not help with their son's huge debts, the bank would take our house. This was particularly painful because my grandparents had disapproved immensely of my parents' marriage, and there was no certainty that they would help. Later that day, I sat in the car next to my mother as she drove from place to place, crying with despair and shame, while trying to sell little packets of hair accessories, all to no avail. She cried, and I felt very sad and very scared. At the time, I didn't appreciate that I was beginning to form a lifelong emotional connection with money. Unconsciously, deep down, I vowed there and then to always have enough money. I would never sit beside my terrified child, crying without a penny to my name. And so began my life's work. To understand how those who always had enough money got it and kept it, and to replicate this in my own life. I learned how people with very little money often stayed that way regardless of how much came into their lives, and how those with very little money can accumulate wealth. I have worked as a debt advisor, a skills specialist, and a business coach, and I also have built a property business, all of which have given me insights into people's successes and failures with money, but more importantly, their mindset. I began by observing and questioning the people around me. I aimed to find out how much money they had, how they got it, and what they did with it. I asked everyone I could about their thoughts on why some had lots of money, and so very many others almost none. Over the years, bit by bit, I pursued my interest relentlessly, and I soon started to see a distinct pattern. How much money you have or don't have depends on your mindset. And I identified 4 key mindsets. My own family background provided me with plenty of clear examples of financial success and failure. Yours might too. My father had come from what was then one of the richest families in Ireland, while my mother hailed from an extremely poor background. Here's what I discovered. My family history. My mother grew up as the daughter of a wood turner in the abject poverty of 1940s Ireland. During my childhood, I spent endless hours talking to my maternal grandmother about her past, and it was from her that I developed a deep interest in history. Granny's life experiences helped me to see the world in a different way, through learning to understand people and the circumstances in which they found themselves. Her grandparents and parents had both survived the Great Hunger, the Irish potato famine of 1848. I vividly remember her telling me about her hometown of Kilcommon in County Tipperary. During the famine, her family was boiling maize in a big pot on the fire. A starving man forced himself in through the window and thrust his hands straight into the boiling pot and began to devour the food. He scalded himself fatally, his hands, mouth and throat burnt out, and he screamed and howled in agony. Despite their best efforts to help him, he died of his injuries in their home. Granny lived through 2 world wars and a civil war in Ireland, and she was a committed socialist. I was enthralled by the story of her being arrested in 1918 for protesting on O'Connell Bridge in Dublin. Granny believed that money was generated from the sweat of the backs of the working man and woman, and that the rich were parasites on the poor. She believed that any ordinary person who managed to feed themselves and their children was good with money. Granny did not have a bank account because she thought they were instruments of the rich. She also feared they might someday close the bank and keep her money. Her household expenses were managed with 3 jars, one for bills, one for food, and one put aside for other expenses. She believed that rich people were rich because they had taken from the poor, and that they were immoral scoundrels. The words she used to describe my father's family are unmentionable. She believed in scripture, blessed are the poor. She felt that the poor people, those with little in the way of money, gave their all, often dying from working down mines, building, or toiling in the fields to make the rich richer, who give them no more than the scrapings from their table. Coming from a very different environment, Dad's family had gardeners and maids, and still paid an allowance to Josephine, the elderly retired family nanny. Dad often told us that his family members were the only ones, besides the ambulance in Cork, with enough petrol to run a car during World War II. I grew up in Cork, literally surrounded by icons of my father's family history of wealth and power. Sutton's Coals, a large coal merchant business, of which my paternal grandfather was the chairman, had been an established name in Cork for 150 years. Sutton House, the large headquarters building, stood in the South Mall, the financial district of Cork. I remember regularly watching the St. Patrick's Day parade with my siblings from the top floor. Family days out with my grandparents involved sailing on their yacht and dinner at the yacht club, where I sat riveted by their conversations with friends. From a young age, I observed that they spoke about very different subjects than my maternal grandparents. I used to ask my paternal grandmother, Eileen Roach, to tell me over and over how her father, William Roach, founded Roach's Stores. William dreamed of setting up a shop that would sell household goods to ordinary people at reasonable prices. Until then, shopping in this way had only been an option open to the rich. William worked relentlessly to achieve his vision. Before striking out on his own, he worked for Cash & Co. in Cork for 9 years, saving every penny he could to fund his business. His first shop failed, and so did the second. His third shop, Roach's Stores, was a huge success, and it developed into a chain of department stores throughout Ireland. The Cork branch, a magnificent building, was situated in the best location on the main street and was Cork's answer to Selfridges in Oxford Street in London. While building the business, however, he slept under an escalator on a straw mattress, his rationale being that because it was so uncomfortable, it would force him out of bed at 5 a.m. every morning to get on with the day's work. My grandfather's uncle, Sir Abraham Sutton, was the High Sheriff of Cork and later Lord Mayor of Cork. His house was close to the one I grew up in and has now been converted into an opulent hotel. I remember returning one evening with Dad and his friend to the yacht club to moor our fishing boat, and Dad's Uncle Stanley Roach's yacht was tied up next to the then Irish Prime Minister's yacht, and Stanley's yacht was bigger. Interestingly, my father was adamant that the Roach branch of the family were not very respectable compared with the Suttons. My father believed that the Suttons had been in business for over 200 years, whereas the Roaches had only been in business for about 70 years. The Sutton side of my family strongly disagreed with my parents' marriage. I came to believe that such disapproval of marriages was almost mandatory, as many of my relatives seemed at one time or another to be a target. When my father's parents, Eric Sutton and Eileen Roach, married, that marriage too had met with disapproval. Eric Sutton's mother, Maud Healy, was horrified and refused to visit their house. A Sutton married to a Roach, oh my God, the Roaches were, horror of horrors, new money. Going back further, when Maud married Graham Sutton, her family was so disgusted that she had stooped to marry trade that, the story goes, her family disowned her. Neither of my grandparents would speak about it, so I was never able to get the full details from them. Growing up with such contrasts within the family was an opportunity to immerse myself in a diverse range of attitudes and behaviours towards people with and without money. In particular, I found the snobbery about new money and class fascinating. My father, grandparents, aunts and uncles had got themselves in such a flap. These marriages had involved one party with a title or social status of old money, which was in fact running out, walking down the aisle with a new money partner, seeking the respectability of old money. From my young perspective, it seemed that old money meant broke, while new money meant actually having the cash. The immediate family influence. My mother believed marrying into a wealthy family would automatically mean that she became wealthy herself. She didn't understand it didn't work like that at all. She never became wealthy and she never appreciated why. She just thought that her in-laws were vicious, mean people who were unwilling to pass some of their excess wealth onto her and my father. My mother had no understanding of the money game. She'd never been brought up to understand that in every market there are buyers and sellers, that people who become wealthy add value and are financially rewarded in return. That's the name of the game, that's how it works. In my father's family, old money was selling social status and respectability, which is why new money was willing to buy. Thus money was shared and continued to flow. In that sense, my mother didn't have any value to add to the Suttons or the Roaches. She spent her married life vacillating between obsequiousness and hatred towards them, depending on whether they were inclined to give our family any money or not. Having been brought up in a poor household, she had only seen examples of rich people at the cinema or in magazines. She thought that the only way for someone like her to become rich would be through someone else giving her money. She never understood that she could have chosen to create her own wealth, but believed that attaining wealth was a matter of luck, like a lottery win, a windfall, a gift or a contribution in her favour. She never understood that to become wealthy in her own right, she would have to develop a system to create it. My father worked for a wage for his own father in Sutton's, a business that my grandfather had inherited, but soon discovered that he had no influence in how that business was run. In a fit of pique, after failing to persuade his father to introduce a change into the business, he left and set up on his own. The period following the failure of my father's business was a terrible time in our lives. My father buried his head in the sand and went fishing for 18 months. My mother took me, my brother and sister and the family cat to live with her parents in another city, where she retrained as a teacher so she could work to support the family. For the next 2 years, the four of us, and the cat, lived in a tiny house with my grandparents, my aunt and her 2 children. I have clear recollection of fighting with my cousin over a piece of meat. 5 of us shared a bedroom. When my little brother was born, he had to be cared for by someone outside of the family because we did not have the space, or my mum the time, to have him with us. I learned some very valuable lessons from this experience. You can endure some very harsh living conditions and still survive. The experience also meant that I was more exposed to how other people behaved with money. My mother's sister, the aunt with whom we shared the house, was a single parent and permanently mired in debt. Although she had a well-paying job, she would spend and spend. She was miserable when in trouble because of her debts, which was most of the time. If somebody bailed her out by way of help from the family, consolidation loans, or through other means, she would simply get into more debt. A bad pay your debts or else letter would arrive, and she would cope with the stress by going on holiday, using borrowed money, convinced that she deserved it because of the stress caused by the debt. I used to shake my head in wonder, and I realised giving her more money would not solve the problem. It would in fact make it worse. She appeared to be in a self-destructive mental pattern. These experiences taught me about different people and different beliefs and behaviours about money. I went from a private school in Cork, where people spoke English, to a state school in Limerick where only Irish was spoken. I learned a great deal at that school, including how to get on with people from all backgrounds. Few of the kids in this school came from wealthy backgrounds, and I could see their parents' mindsets were very different to the mindsets of the parents at my previous private school. 2 years later, my mother, now with 4 children, returned to the family home in Cork, where she got a job as a school teacher and worked until she retired about 30 years later. A broken man, my father went to work for Rocha Stores in a job he loathed with every fibre of his being. He continued to work there for the remainder of his working life, forcing himself to go in every day because he feared he would not be able to claim his company pension if he retired early. My parents ground on for the rest of their lives, hating their jobs, hating the unjust taxation system, and never seeming to get ahead. They were taxed so highly that we remained poor, even when they both had reasonably good jobs. When the exhaust pipe on my dad's car broke, he tied it up with string because we could not afford to have it mended. The phone was regularly disconnected because we could not pay the bill. The man from the electricity company regularly turned up to disconnect our electricity. Mum had to choose between dental care for herself and university fees for us. She let her teeth rot. Because of these experiences, both my parents bitterly resented anyone with their own business or anyone on benefits. They felt people with businesses could avoid the crippling taxes they had to endure in 1980s Ireland. Two of my uncles on my father's side ran businesses, and my parents thought life was so much easier for them. However, I remember both my uncles almost losing their homes on more than one occasion, and they had several business failures between them, 5 or 6 that I can remember. Instead of giving up, they got up and started another business until they were successful, and they did eventually become very successful. They had a terrible time when things went wrong, but they did not get completely crushed as my dad did. They were resilient. My parents resented those on benefits. They held the opinion that they were supporting such people by paying taxes and going without themselves, while benefit recipients received so much more. I recall my parents feeling betrayed because whilst both of them worked, none of us could have eye tests or glasses or dental treatment. People on benefits, however, could easily get this treatment for free. At the age of 63, my dad had a massive panic attack and was unable to work again. His uncle who owned the business arranged for him to retire with his pension, but his health was destroyed. He was barely able to walk and remained in constant pain. This time of life should have been a fairy tale ending to a very tough journey for my parents, but it ended tragically. In the early 2000s, Dad spotted that Anglo-Irish Bank shares were set to rise. He bought 72,000 shares over the next 3 or 4 years, which at their height were worth over €17 a share. My mother, myself and one of my siblings also had a large holding of these shares. My abiding memory of my father is of him sitting in front of the television, scrolling Bloomberg TV hour after hour, year after year, watching the Anglo-Irish Bank share price. I sold my shares in the summer of 2006 against my father's advice because I needed to fund a business that would provide my family with immediate cash flow. My father and siblings held complete faith that the shares would keep rising and rising. On the 2nd of September 2007, he told me that they would double in price over the coming 2 years. Dad died 5 days later. My mother and siblings held their nerve and kept their holdings while my father's estate went through probate. But on the 15th of January 2009, the Anglo-Irish Bank was nationalised and they lost everything. None of them ever enjoyed any of the good things the money could have done for them. It was as if they were destined not to be rich, even though the wealth was theirs for the taking. Years later, my mother was still in shock. My quest. My family experience around money was terrible, but I knew that there had to be something more to it than simple bad luck. What made some people always come up trumps and end up wealthy while others never made it? How did some manage to become rich again and again after losing everything? Why did others seem destined to struggle forever, no matter how much money came their way? I recognised that there was some kind of pattern going on, and that was causing it to happen. I had seen different people approach the same events in different ways and get different results. So was it the approach that accounted for these differing results? Untangling this became for me an all-consuming goal. After working as a debt advisor, my conclusion is your money mindset makes all the difference. And I discovered 4 money